This chapter covers the issue of poverty, which is a theme which should really be running through your minds throughout the length of the semester and really throughout the length of your career. But when we start talking about social welfare and social welfare policy, naturally the topic of poverty can't be separated from it in any way at all. This chapter really gives kind of a thumbnail sketch of issues about poverty. We can spend more than a semester studying the issue, but at least this is enough to get us started in a discussion and consideration of some of the major issues for persons who live in poverty. The text points out that there are three categories of people, generally speaking, that live in poverty. Might be able to really extend this a little bit. In fact, I already have. One is those individuals that are in the workforce, the labor force that we refer to as the working poor. These are the persons that are the minimum wage workers, trying to make ends meet on a salary that, as we go along here, you're going to see is really impossible to survive on simply with one job. Some years back, you're very possibly familiar with this. Barbara Ehrenreich, I believe is how you pronounce her name, wrote a book on the low wage workforce called Nickel and Dimed. And if you haven't read the book, I really recommend that you do that sometime, because it talks about the existence of individuals who are working. Most of them in this book are waitresses, and a good sociological experiment. She went out into the world and lived on the income of low-wage workers for several months, and then wrote this book about it. And it's really a very interesting book, and worth your time if you have the opportunity. It was written in I think the 1990s now, so it's been some time since it's been published, but it's still very valid and worth your attention. So the minimum wage workers are one category of people living in poverty. The unemployed, and I added to that the underemployed. The text, at least at this point, doesn't talk about the underemployed, but the unemployed persons, of course, have no job. The underemployed are working, but not in full-time work by any stretch of the imagination, and either not working full-time and or working below their skill level entirely, because they're not able to find full-time work in their particular area of expertise. And then also those persons who are in poor health or have an occupational disability that cannot work. Now, you could add to this children and elderly also, but these are not persons that we tend to think of. I guess they're considered to be part of the unemployed here in this category, but to me they're an entirely separate category. The last category, those in poor health or occupational disability, are really the poor that in the old traditional way of thinking, and as we've talked about earlier, have been considered the worthy poor to many individuals, whereas the unemployed are considered the unworthy poor. Now, poverty can be defined as deprivation, either absolute or relative. And absolute poverty are those situations where there's an unequivocal lack of the resources needed to survive at all. Not adequate shelter, not adequate food, clothing, those kinds of things. Just those basic needs aren't met. That is really absolute poverty. Another term you often hear is abject poverty or extreme poverty. Relative poverty refers to deprivation that, is relative to the standard of living in which most of us enjoy. When you ask people about poverty, sometimes, a lot of times persons will say, we grew up poor, but we never really considered ourselves to be poor. And perhaps this is the relative poverty category. We're compared to others, we're poor, but we have other rich things that make us very rich, and that's certainly, I can't deny the validity of a person's viewpoint about their existence as a child or as a young person, but when asking about the question about poverty, and someone says, well, we never really considered ourselves poor, even though we were poor. It kind of suggests in a way that poverty is a state of mind, and for those people living in poverty, clearly it's something much more than that. There are all sorts of theories about what causes poverty, and that's a good question. It might still actually being asked. At one time, our administration, a few administrations back at OCS, actually directed us to insert a couple questions into our interviewing process with individuals that we were hiring in child protection. And one of those questions was, why are people poor? Looking for the applicant to come up with a sort of a philosophy of poverty, I suppose. And of course, if you ever get asked this question in a job interview and considering your circumstance, here's a tip. You want to talk about structural issues much more than individual issues, because our tendency is to blame the person for their poverty and to say, well, they drink, they don't hold down a steady job, they didn't get enough education, all those kinds of things, without looking at all the reasons behind those factors, which are indeed contributing to the poverty, but really have the roots in much larger issues regarding our system as it exists. One of the most infamous, I would call infamous theories about poverty, and that is the culture of poverty theory. It suggests really that the poor are different from the rest of us, that they have these traits that are transmitted intergenerationally, and this transcends national or even international region. It doesn't have anything to do with whether they live in the city or in the country. There are identified a number of similarities in family structures among poor families. That, for instance, oftentimes the father is absent from the home, and so it's a maternal, matriarchal system, which is, well, for a number of reasons, that creates problems in terms of the economic system because of the way women are treated. That time orientation, that poor people are unable to delay gratification, that they live for the moment, that they have to have instant rewards for the things that they do. They can't save money, those kinds of things. And clearly, in this perception, the blame rests solely on the character of the poor and their behavior. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Daniel Moynihan wrote a book about poverty that really bought into the culture of poverty, and he became a United States Senator ultimately. But he was, there was a lot of experts that were very upset with this theory, and because it just points the finger on towards the individual person as to being blamed for their condition. Another theory is somewhat related, perhaps, but it's eugenics theory that has this assumption that poor people are genetically inferior, that this is something somehow that's handed out intergenerational. I think perhaps the culture of poverty may be more sociological in nature, whereas the eugenics theory is more of a biological premise that suggests that that there are traits that are handed down genetically that explain poverty. So thinkers like Jensen and Herrnstein and Murray, and this is as late as the 1990s, suggesting that inequality relates to lower levels of genetic intelligence. So the theory, Herrnstein's and Murray's theory was that it was really we were wasting our money spending it on the education of the poor because their innate deficiencies. You hear a little bit of that come up in discussions about affirmative action, and I believe it was Justice Scalia, that raised the question of whether or not we were really helping minorities with affirmative action by putting them in programs that was perhaps above their capacity to really perform well, and so we were setting them up for failure. There certainly seems to be some intimations of a belief of genetic inferiority among minorities. Now, I'm not quoting that exactly, and he may have had other other ideas in his head as he said that, but nonetheless, it raises the question about what exactly he was talking about there. Eugenics was popular, 100 years or so ago, and actually was thought to be sort of the answer to things. How we were going to make the human race and life better was basically by weeding out these inferior characteristics, and poverty was seen as one of those inferior characteristics. This is during the period of time when, just to kind of tie back to something we talked about a week or so ago, when children were being taken from their parents simply because the parents were poor, because they weren't making ends meet and things like that. And there was a belief in that time that children were better off being taken away from this culture, or from this setting. Now that suggests something more of a sociological kind of a causation theory, but nonetheless, the idea is that there is something defective and deficient with these individuals that will never permit them to do better. So. Of course, with Adolf Hitler used eugenics as sort of the basis for his notions of the master race, and eugenics became quite unpopular because of that. And I'd say thank God. But there are still some hints of that sometimes in social welfare policy, and you have to listen and look, maybe sometimes not too closely, but I think it was Kansas that some years ago was offering stipends to recipients of public assistance if they agreed to a Norplant birth control device being placed in them, and the idea was, of course, to prevent them from producing more children, recipients from producing more children. So again, just a kind of a eugenics thing to that. So. And then other theories are more progressive and propose that the poor are exploited by capitalists, the elite, and by our elected representatives, and sort of fits more into kind of, I think, the philosophy that the National Association of Social Workers have. And there are many things in the way our system is structured that sets this up, including how we divide up labor and assign status to different jobs and things like that. So poverty often grows from this because the higher status roles are the ones that get the greater reward, and with greater reward comes greater rights to things. And so the rewards aren't based on the value of one's contribution to society. If that were the case, I would say garbage collectors would be paid a lot of money, because if you've ever had garbage collected on your doorstep, you know how important that is, right? It isn't based on their contributions to society. It's based on the value of their contributions to the market, and that's where the capitalist system comes into play. There is some of you who had classes with me previously may have read this article. I'm sure I recommended it one time or another, by Herbert Gans. It's called The Uses of Poverty. It's an old 60s article, I think, 70s maybe, kind of a classic article, and he talks about how poverty is useful to society, and kind of suggests to you that from that perspective, and it was a functionalist sociological perspective, that society would always keep poor people around because, well, they serve so many different purposes and functions. And this article listed, a couple dozen, maybe 18 different uses of poverty for the larger society. It's called The Uses of Poverty. If you're interested in reading it, and I can share that with you if you'd like it. Just let me know. So anyway, progressive theorists believe that really poverty is only going to be eliminated by a fundamental alteration in our economic system and in the social fabric of our society. And certainly, I think that's true. As long as we are married to capitalism, I've said this before, I'll say it again, it's going to be very hard to break away from this cycle where there are poor people and there are greatly wealthy people, because the system is set up to make profit the ultimate sign of success. And when people gain profit, other people lose, and the poor are required to be poor in order to prop up that economy. So now there are ways to do this, I think, without becoming totally socialistic in our society, but nonetheless, it would take us the capacity. It would take the capacity to really kind of break away from these old notions that we have, and this isn't something that would happen very easily. Democratic socialism in our system right now is kind of pushing in that direction, but it doesn't take much to listen to the backlash to that from even many people that are somewhat to the left in the political spectrum. So who are the poor? And I'm not going to read these statistics to you. I mean, you can see them for yourself. There's a better breakdown of these statistics in the text. It's Spotlight 5.2. It's a box. It's not a table for whatever reason. But you know, our poverty rate in 2014, which is the last that this text actually refers to, is 14.8%. It's interesting to me that this text was, it's got a 2018 publication date, and yet a lot of the statistics kind of stop around 2015 or 16. Donald Trump's barely mentioned in this book, and I really would like to see a little bit of what the author's take is on his presidency and how it's impacting the system. But unfortunately, any perspective on that is going to have to come from me. So, but in any event, poverty rate is pretty stable the last few years. I think it's higher now than it was in the last year before. The 2007 was the last year before the recession. Our economy hasn't still recovered. Especially, again, the poor are the ones who suffer the most in any kind of an economic crisis, and they have yet to fully recover from that disaster. For children under 18, the poverty rate is 21%, and that's an important point. Of course, that the more children, the largest percentage of people who are poor are children. If you're African American or Hispanic, you're twice or more as likely to be poor than non-Hispanic whites or Asian Americans. The younger you are, the more likely you are to be poor. It's interesting that the elderly have fared much better than they did back in the 50s and the 60s, and a lot of that has to do with the indexing of Social Security to the cost of living and really more widespread. In the 50s, a lot of people who were retiring hadn't contributed into the Social Security system much, and so they might have still been poor. But by the time by this time, all of us have spent numbers of years in the Social Security system contributing to it, and so we're benefiting more as we get older from that system. Women are more likely to be poor than males. Older women much more likely to be poor than older males. If you're foreign born, you're more likely to be poor. The South and the West have higher incidences of poverty than the Northeast and than the Midwest. The disabled are more than 2 times as likely to live in poverty. You can see here that your degrees pay off. Your education, the more education you have, the less you're likely to be living in poverty. Now that doesn't mean that your degree guarantees you that you're going to be able to climb the social and economic ladder dramatically, as we all hope we will, but certainly it's a great hedge against the possibility of ever having to live in poverty. Married couples have a lower instance of poverty than either single male households or single female households, and single female households have twice the poverty rate that single male households do. Again, not surprising the way that our labor market and the economic system is set up. And interesting, just something from another table in this chapter. If you look at these figures of persons below the poverty line, in 1959, 22.4% of individuals lived below the poverty line, and 10 years later that number had dropped to 12.1. Now what happened during that decade? That was the decade of the Great Society and all the federal government interventions in poverty. Once again, Social Security was also indexed during this period of time, which also helped a great deal. But you see here that government programs do have an effect on poverty. And this is mentioned elsewhere in the text as well. Now, poverty rate has gone back up again, and there are a number of different factors that can explain that as well. But it was going down until the time of the Reagan administration. 1978 was the last, well, it was about the middle of the Carter administration, I guess, or early in the Carter administration. So by the time Reagan took office, our social welfare system changed pretty dramatically. The poverty rate climbed back up to a certain extent. There are all sorts of things that push people in and out of poverty, and things like the changes in their household income because of divorce or marriage, somebody abandoning the family, births of children, deaths of children, accidents, and things like that that can cause either loss of employment or excessive medical bills and things like that. So these are all things that contribute to poverty that are really beyond the control of individuals very much. Children born today have about the same chance to rise in mobility as they did in the 1970s, but the inequalities, the difference between the rich and the poor has increased a great deal, and so this really has, while it may be a somewhat bright, and I'm not sure it is totally bright, but a somewhat bright perspective for children growing up in middle class and upper middle class and upper class homes. If you're poor, this means that you're more likely to be staying right where you are as well, and more and more individuals are in that category. So this isn't a positive thing by any stretch of the imagination. And if you're listening to what people are saying, when you hear economists talking in the news the last a few years, there is a lot of discussion about the fact that the younger generation, that would be the millennials, you folks, maybe cannot assume that you're going to do better than your parents, and that this is one of the first times in American history, I guess, that's ever been the case. Where you live geographically has a lot to do with whether you can climb the social ladder or not, and I think a lot of that ties into some of the statistics we were looking at a few minutes ago about regional differences, but also has something to do with what kind of work is particularly connected to particular regions. I think the textbook says something about, is it San Jose? Do they say? I think where has a relatively high rate of upward mobility, and yet that's a tech area, and so it's not too surprising. The poverty threshold line, the poverty line, and they talk about different ways to define that in the text, but it's pretty close to the same thing. But there is a difference, and so if you're really assessing poverty, it's worth knowing what the difference is between the poverty threshold and the other name kind of escapes me at the moment, but there's different definitions of poverty. But for a family of four, at least, the poverty line in 2013 was $23,834. Now I can't imagine raising a family of four on that kind of money, but this threshold is redesigned or redefined every year. It's reconfigured every year, and it's essentially based on an old formula that takes the least expensive food plan for a healthy. This was created by the USDA, I think, around the time that the food stamp program was created, in the late 50s, early 60s. But takes the least expensive food plan that is healthy for a family of four and multiplies that times three, because the perception was at that time that most people were spending about a third of their income on food. That's not likely the case anymore, by the way, but that was how they figured that. But the issues with the poverty index, like for instance, it doesn't reflect family structure and type. So a family of four could have one working parent or two working parents with 2 or 3 children. Doesn't have anything to do with healthcare costs, which for some healthcare insurance is there, for some it's not, that kind of thing. Doesn't account for how the needs change across the family lifespan. It's more expensive if you're a foster parent. You have a higher stipend for little children, a higher stipend for teenagers, and in between, the stipend goes down. At least that's how it's been traditionally. I'm assuming it's still the same way, and that's because at different stages of life, children require more money from you. If you have a child heading for college, there's a lot more money needed. Doesn't account for job and income insecurity that's brought on by, the textbook refers to it as casualness, I think, of the job market. Basically that, there aren't a lot of commitments made by employers as compared to how it used to be. You used to be able to count on an employer sticking by you if you stuck with the employer, and it's not always the case anymore. People are packing up and moving all the time, and this has a great impact, that insecurity. And it says also, for those people who live close to the limit, a few dollars over, a few dollars under, it doesn't mean, if you're living above the poverty line, it really doesn't mean anything. It isn't just your income that matters when we talk about poverty, of course. Children in single mother households, and I don't mean to, and nor does the authors, I'm sure, but I don't mean to single out women, but single mother households, as we just noted, are one of the family compositions where poverty is at its highest rate. And so single mother households have higher incidences of learning disability among their children, attention deficit disorder diagnoses. The kids have more absences from school for longer periods of time. They are more likely to have visits to the emergency room because they don't have adequate health care otherwise. More likely to have unmet dental needs, and I would venture to say more likely to have unmet medical needs as well. There's no such thing as prevention when you live in a poor home. Child support payments has something to do with poverty, and less than half of the custodial parents of children in 2011 received full support payments. There's something less than 50%. And these child support payments, it said, constitute as much as 16% of the annual income in these families. The Welfare Reform Bill of 1996, the personal responsibility, blah, 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 pro rata legislation under Bill Clinton focused upon what they were referred to as deadbeat dads in those days. It isn't just fathers, but mostly fathers. Those parents who were contributing to child support payments, and also putting pressure on mothers to identify fathers and to assist in locating them. And sometimes mothers didn't want to do that. They didn't want to stir things up, sometimes for very good reasons, because the fathers that were absent were abusive. But in any event, there was a lot of things built into that to try to bring these fathers back into making payments, or to penalize them financially if they were failing to do so. I mentioned earlier about the decreasing poverty rates for the elderly, but nonetheless higher for women over 65 and much higher for elderly Hispanics and elderly African Americans. A lot of those figures that we were looking at when we weren't looking specifically at race are what we call aggregated statistics, and when you break them out, when you disaggregate them, I guess is the term, you're going to find out the poverty rates for age groups and things like this, that race has a major factor to play in how high the poverty rate is for all those categories. And rural poverty is one of those things that's a little more invisible because it just isn't in the news that much. I think that this is a lot of the group that, and this is just simply my perception, but I think this is a lot of the people who are the strong supporters of President Trump are the rural poor, because he's made a lot of promises to stand up for them, and they seem to believe that he's doing that. But the rural poor have poverty rates that oftentimes exceed the rates of those individuals living in the inner city, which is something to get a lot more attention. Rural blacks, rural Hispanics still have a poverty rate more than double that of rural white persons. So about a quarter of the workers. Now, these aren't people who aren't working. These are people who are working. About a quarter of the United States workers live below or near the poverty line. These are what we call the working poor, and represents really a segment of our population that is growing all the time. So 23% of the persons living in poverty are working poor, and there are a lot of it's not the workers' faults. This has a lot to do with the sociological phenomena that's going on in our society, including the relocation of industry, replacement of industrial jobs, largely with service positions. By service positions, I mean positions in the service industry. And industrial workers, factory workers, historically through the 40s, after the war in particular, but remember that collective bargaining was codified, during the New Deal years, and so through the 50s and 60s and 70s and maybe into the 80s as well, a lot of factory workers had very strong unions that were advocating for them, and consequently, individuals who didn't have advanced degrees or anything like this were living comfortable lives. Probably not getting rich, but still living very comfortably because of the union wages. And people have created a lot of resentment about unions because they blame that for a lot of the troubles that the auto industry has had in meeting expenses and things like this. But in any event, most of those industrial positions were union positions. Most of the service positions, the service sector positions, are not union positions by any means. There are a lot of workers that are underemployed, as I mentioned earlier, either working part-time or below their skill level. There are what we call discouraged workers, those who are just dropping out of their job search. They've been looking for so long they've just given up. There are differences in unemployment also. The structural unemployment, which is really when, well, for instance, Carrier moves to Mexico, let's say from Indianapolis, and closes factories or loses thousands of jobs. Many of those workers have worked for that industry for years and years and years, or over 50 years of age perhaps. The odds of them easily finding other jobs are pretty slim. The older you get, the harder it is to get hired into positions, and so this creates these what we call structural unemployment, long-term labor market issues. And as well as the fact that during recessions, downturns, in production and things like that occur. Then there's frictional unemployment, which is businesses opening, businesses closing, this kind of standard part of the capitalist economy, which is less damaging. And then chronic unemployment versus cyclical unemployment, which cyclical being something to do with the market and the ups and downs in the market. The typical length of unemployment is about 31 weeks. It's longer for older workers. As I mentioned, that's more than a half a year. And the longer the worker is out of the labor force, the more difficult it's going to be for that person to be seen as employable. Now, one of the issues with the labor market, of course, is what the authors refer to as the dual labor market, that is primary versus secondary labor market. Now, the secondary labor market, I think you see a lot of these very marginally employed individuals and those persons who, again, work in the service sector and those kinds of things, have very poor working conditions, low wages. The positions themselves are not necessarily stable. Little chance for advancement. Very arbitrary discipline on the part of bosses and things like that, and a lot of people believe that this is brought on by the decrease in union membership and the increase in service sector jobs. One of the criticisms in the welfare to work program is that there's no doubt about it that the welfare reforms in 1996 cut the welfare rolls, but as one author says in a book that I use for my social welfare class, she said, getting people off of welfare, getting women off of welfare, and getting women out of poverty are two entirely different things, and the welfare reform's done a good job of getting them off of welfare, while reducing the number of people on welfare, but hasn't done such a great job of getting them out of poverty. The jobs that they do move into are some of this secondary labor market kind of positions like you're talking about, very low wage and no chance for advancement, no future involved at all, and oftentimes without the kind of benefits that they need. For instance, and this is Karen Seacom in her book, which is called "So You Think I Drive a Cadillac." She says, it can be a responsible parental decision for a woman who's receiving a public assistance and getting Medicaid coverage for her kids, particularly if her kids have any kind of medical issues at all. It can be responsible for them to decide to stay on welfare and not go to work as long as they can, because a lot of times when they go off to work, they don't have medical coverage anymore, and their children lose health care. So a minimum wage job at $7.25 an hour, and I think it's a little higher than that now. That's what the book said, was quoted anyway. And of course, it varies from state to state. It's higher in Alaska, but the federal minimum wage, $7.25 an hour. It's higher than that, I believe now. But anyway, it's $7.25 an hour, $13,920 a year. So if you have two kids, consider trying to raise them on that. 69% of the poverty minimum level, 69%. And so working full time, even for yourself without children, it's virtually impossible to support yourself, to live on your own like that. So the living wage movement has kind of grown up, or the out of this issue, or the fight for 15 is another term that they've been used, and many municipalities around the nation have required certain employers, any employers, to get any kind of government subsidies, at least in their communities. And I think this varies from community to community. They've implemented this requirement that the minimum wage be at least $15 an hour. I think California is phasing that in next year. I believe the minimum wage will be $15 an hour in California, I think it says. So the idea is instead of making a minimum wage, you make a living wage. It is that you make enough to live on. And that's all very relative. It depends on the size of your family, of course, and all sorts of other things. So what do we do about poverty? There are three different approaches that the authors refer to that give us some kind of way to consider that. One is the curative approach, and really what this approach is, the one that is probably the one most associated with big government, which is which is more associated with the current form of help that is provided by government. Although this is a theme that runs through really all of the programs, including all the New Deal programs, and that is to help the poor. The curative approach is to help the poor to become self-supporting through supporting changes in their lives and the environment. That is, put them to work, get them working. And when you think about those 9 values, you remember early in the semester we talked about the 9 American values that Phyllis Day writes about in her text. The Puritan morality, the Protestant work ethic, that rugged individualism, all those things kind of tie into this, this notion that it is the right thing to do, it is the moral thing to do, to work and to take care of yourself and to take care of your own. And on the face of it, this seems like a sensible attitude, a healthy attitude, and yet again, that works well for those of us that have access to the resources in our society, but those resources aren't equally distributed nor equally available. And that's an important piece to keep in mind. But I always say, when we talk about how do we cure poverty, in social welfare classes, one of the first things that students will come up with is, well, more education. Others say, more job opportunities, but really more education is the big emphasis. And I always say, what good does it do to have an advanced degree or even a high school diploma if there isn't a job out there, for you? And remember, 1 in 20 people looking for work in this economy, by definition, if the economy is working right, 1 in 20 are not going to be able to find work. So it doesn't do you any good to have a lot of education in those circumstances. But that's the curative approach. Get everybody to work, get them trained, and get them out there working at whatever kind of jobs available out there, even if it is in the secondary labor market. The alleviative approach is really something that's probably more associated with big government, so to speak, and that is to ease the suffering of the poor through assistance programs and the New Deal, which, by the way, was still very married to capitalism. It wasn't socialism by any stretch of the imagination. There was some democratic socialism, I guess is what we'd say. There was we became a bit of a social welfare state through the New Deal, but nonetheless, we remained a capitalist state, and so there wasn't a huge change in our economic system because of those programs, as helpful as they were. Likewise with the Great Society as well, but the Great Society is a great example of efforts to alleviate poverty through all these different kinds of programs that were engaged, trying to engage theoretically would engage the poor in changing their communities. And then the preventive approach, the social insurance programs such as Social Security and also I think probably health insurance through the Affordable Care Act, that would insure against the cost of accidents, death, old age, unemployment, disability, those kinds of things. If we have funds set aside or programs set aside to take care of us during these periods of time, then that's a way to combat poverty. And many of the New Deal programs did that. Certainly Social Security has done that, and as I've mentioned, I think it's helped to alleviate, at least among the elderly, it's helped to alleviate poverty to a certain extent. John Kenneth Galbraith identified two different types of poverty in his work, the affluent America, I think, is the name of it, and one was case poverty, which really talks about the cases, the deficiencies in human capital, and this could be the. I would have to guess that this has something to do with things not being available to the individuals, but by and large, this focuses upon the human deficiencies and the old belief that the poor are responsible for their situation. And then area poverty, which does have a kind of a macro approach to it and looks at regional economic problems and things such as that. So the focus during the Great Society, for instance, on the poverty in Appalachia, which is a big deal during the 1960s and early 70s, that suggests that there was some awareness of the fact that poverty had a lot to do with also just where you were living and what resources were available to you. So depending upon the particular type of approach you want to take among the three ways to combat poverty or the two different types of poverty, it really has a lot to do with the kinds of programs that are put in place. And so when you're thinking about policy decisions and things like this, consider also perhaps, is there another approach or another perspective that would change the policy and make it more effective? So historically, from the times of the Johnson administration and the Great Society, rather, in 1965, the mid 60s, to the time that Reagan came to office in the early 80s, policies were grounded in belief that public expenditures should focus on stimulating opportunity for the poor. That's the demand side economics. It says that put money in the hands of those who the consumers, and that will improve the economy. Whereas after Reagan, we switched to a trickle-down theory, and we've really, although there have been some attempts to kind of move back towards more of a Keynesian approach, we have never really left the trickle-down. We've seen tax cuts for the wealthy and several times during these administrations, the Reagan administration and certainly the George W. Bush administration. We saw that, and again, just more recently in the Trump administration. There were some efforts, I think, however ill-fated or half-hearted, I don't know what you would call it, during the Obama administration to increase taxes for the wealthy, but with the Congress that he was working with, there was no hope that anything would ever change there. And it is one of the things that Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Socialists talk about, increasing the tax rate on the wealthy and those kinds of things, so that would kind of put an end to the notion that if we put more money in the hands of the producers, that's going to benefit the economy, and that the benefits to the poor would increase. So this particular approach in the last mostly 40 years have been to cut expenditures on public programs and increase tax cuts, largely for the wealthy class. I just read an article fairly recently suggested that the businesses that in the Trump tax cuts in 2007, 2018, I guess, where the notion was is that they're going to cut taxes to the corporations so that they could, you know, raise wages and all those kinds of things. Well, you very early on you heard a big flurry of activities where people, Walmart I think was giving bonuses to employees and things like that. What I read was that something like 84% of the corporations and businesses did not change any of their compensation packages as a result of that tax cut, which is pretty much what I think most of us would expect. So, as I pointed out earlier, the main factor responsible for the decrease in the poverty rates in the 60s and 70s had to do with Great Society programs, it appears. So there's the last few topics in this particular chapter is a little depressing, and partly because I think as I read through those chapters, I realized that it's really cutting much closer to home, because they're really, in many respects, beginning to talk about people that are struggling to make ends meet. These are people that I know, could even be myself in some respects, but it's called the fringe economy. That after the Great Recession, what happened is a lot of Americans realized they were overextended in credit and were living above their means. They had homes that they owed more than the homes were worth, and all those kinds of things. And as we've talked about, the issues with poverty have increased a great deal since that time. At this time, many poor people have no banks. They're called unbanked, and if they do have a bank account, they may be functionally poor because they have a debt load that is over their capacity to keep up with. I mean, to live a decent life. And so this is increasingly reaching into the middle class. It isn't strictly the lower economic class that are suffering from some of these things. But there are all sorts of exploitative services that have mushroomed in the last since the time of the Great Recession, that are really kind of exploiting the poor and the individual, the financial problems, and it's become big business. These have become very, very lucrative businesses for these individuals, and there's several pages of descriptions of how these businesses work: the preloaded debit cards, the prepaid phone cards, rent-to-own businesses, pawn shops, car title pawns, payday loans, online lenders, check cashing outlets, used car sales. All of these things have practices that are, apparently they're legal, but they certainly seem to be predatory in many respects. And so it's worth reading up on those things, avoiding those things, and helping your clients avoid those things as well. The author says the poor pay more than the middle class for financial services in both absolute dollars and relative to their income. These costs are aggravated by a dual financial system, with one system for the poor and another for the middle and upper classes. This dual system leads to even greater inequality, and the fringe economy represents a financial exploitation that depletes the resources of poor families and communities. A few slides on global poverty. They're kind of a hopeful point, I suppose, that now there's less than 1 billion people living in abject poverty around the world. Poverty is defined as having an income of less than $2 a day. Now, $2 in other parts of the world, of course, mean a great deal different than it does here in our economy, but nonetheless, you get the idea. This is poor. There is another excellent film on poverty. I may have mentioned it earlier, called The City of God. It's a Brazilian film. I highly recommend it, and it really shows what happens in Rio when an effort was made to provide housing for homeless individuals. I mean, when you see the poverty in that movie, it's so disturbing just to see what people are living with, and all the kinds of horrible things that have developed because of that. But it's less than half of the people that were living in poverty, or about half of the people were living in poverty in 1990. So What explains that? I'm not really sure how we explain that. It doesn't, and the text doesn't really go into an explanation of it either. But it does say that any decrease in the poverty rate around the world is threatened by such things as climate change, which is going to cause the prices of food to go up and economies to crumble around the world. And as that happens, there'll be less aid and less charitable contributions coming in to alleviate this terrible poverty. And it's often the case. The poor persons are the ones. The poor are the ones who suffer the most for such things as global warming, even though they do so little to contribute to global warming. I mean, they're not really producing all the carbons that they're creating, these greenhouse gases that we seem to be suffering from now. But the members of the markets, I'm sorry, indicators of global poverty around the world, such as a high infant mortality, shorter lifespan, poor agricultural self-sufficiency, greater food insecurity, really is greatest among some of those nations that really have the least to do with creating the problems to begin with. And there are a number of non-governmental organizations, those charitable foundations that are mentioned, that are trying to alleviate issues related to poverty. But it also points out that some of those that are attached to religious organizations also have do their share of proselytizing and pushing political agendas on the recipients as well. The United Nations Millennium Summit mentioned 8 development goals that the member nations all agreed to. This was back in 2000, and eliminating poverty and increasing primary education, empowering women, reducing child mortality, and also improving maternal health, eradicating disease, working towards environmental sustainability, and with at least some of the leaders of the Western world these days, that may be one of the hardest things to achieve. And then the development of global partnerships in areas of trade and debt relief and aid. But one author says that by 2050, the world is going to have to feed 2.5 billion more people. That's how much the population of the globe is going to increase. And in order to do that, the food production would have to nearly double in order to meet that need. But the way climate changing is impacting agricultural areas, it's drying up a lot of what used to be agricultural areas. Drinking water is becoming more scarce, and overfishing is depleting the resources in the ocean as well. It's going to become very difficult for food production to keep up with the need. And so at the current rate, this observer says the current method of water and energy intensive farming will exhaust the Earth's resources before the world is able to feed the additional people in it. Now, this sounds a little like Malthusian concerns, 100, 200 years ago, when there was worried that the population was growing faster than our ability to produce food, and we have found ways through innovations in agriculture to dramatically increase food production. And so I don't intend to minimize the message of this last little piece here, but by the same token, we can hope that there will continue to be innovation and work to improve our capacity to feed these people, as well as to perhaps get a hold of some of the production of more and more people that's going on in many parts of the earth. Okay, well, that's all I have on poverty, and if there's any comments or questions, please let me know. Otherwise, tune in for the next chapter just around the corner.